Hello and welcome to the studio. I'm Chris Kent and this is the latest edition in my occasional studio poetry diary. I've mentioned before that I try and start every day by reading a poem aloud, and I think it's something I started when a friend of mine who's a concert pianist told me that he starts his day by playing a Bach prelude and fugue, and I suppose the idea is the same. It concentrates the mind and engages all the processes and skills we need for the work ahead. And today I'm starting my studio day with some lines from Shakespeare, the speech that begins, "Our revels now are ended," from the Tempest. It's a beautiful and well-known speech, and that brings with it a particular set of challenges, because how do we make the familiar sound new? How do we make sure the words themselves are conveyed and not just a general wash of sound and emotion? Well, one of the first theatre directors I ever worked with, a wonderful director called Annie Castledine, used to say, "Don't generalize, be specific." In other words, make sure there is an absolute clarity of intention behind the lines that we're speaking. Many of us as actors are familiar with the Stanislavskian notions of objective and superobjective. In other words, what is my character trying to achieve at this moment through what they say, and what is their overarching objective through the course of the play or film or whatever we're working on. And we also know how to divide a text into beats, each one of which has an intention. And this is actually also an incredibly useful and transferable skill in commercial voice acting and voiceover, especially in short texts like advertising copy and movie trailers, where it's absolutely crucial that each individual line has its own intention. And I've been thinking about this advice and this particular piece of Shakespeare, Our Revels Now Are Ended, because I was recently asked to read it at the funeral of a very dear friend, Moira. It's a famous speech, of course, and very poignant and apt because it seems to speak so potently about the transience of life and especially the end of life, but not an easy thing to do. So don't generalize, be specific. It's never more important than with something famous to go back to the original text and to understand its true context and significance. And as always, we have to establish the 4 W's. Who, what, where and why. Who is speaking? What do they say? Where are they, both physically and within the overall narrative? And why do they say what they say? And when I did this, it reminded me that this isn't actually a speech about death at all, at least not literally. The character Prospero, the Duke and Overlord of his own magical island, has staged a masque, a theatrical entertainment. And when it finishes, he says, "Our revels now are ended." It's actually about the end of a play. And he says the actors have vanished into thin air, as has the scenery, the towers and palaces and other fantastical things he describes, and also the great globe itself, he says, which Shakespeare's audience would have understood to mean the world of the imagination, but also, of course, the great globe theatre. And with Shakespeare, there is always metaphor. A play is a transient thing, which, like life itself, begins and ends in silence, and through the course of which we are transformed. And in the play, Prospero is about to give up his powers, as indeed was Shakespeare himself. We think this is probably the last or one of the last plays that he wrote. And he lived and worked, like us, in a time of plague and pandemic, when the theatres were often closed. And of course, our friend Moira, who was a teacher of English and inspired generations of young people, would have known all this, as did her family. So that was my note to myself. Don't generalize. Be specific. And another thing that same director used to say, play the words, and the metaphor will take care of itself. Our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. and like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep.